things to report upon. At the end of last week, I tuned into a SIPFA training session. The session covered future audit arrangements, the new SIPFA code, work going on the role of the PCC in the future. There's some work going on in collaboration between police authorities, and there's a SIPFA review of internal audit arrangements as well. What I propose to do is, this was the end of last week, I'll send a detailed note of the meeting around to members. The other thing I was going to mention is the February the 10th meeting, 22, is my last meeting as the chair. We discussed this morning, the members, and we're putting in place some arrangements for taking this forward. That's the only thing that I would like to mention on the chair's report. Anyone got any issues on that? No? Okay, we'll move on to the minutes then. First of all, are there any comments on the accuracy of the minutes? I think we're okay on, no. On the action log, that's been done. The training event with firearms is scheduled for the next meeting, I believe. Any other points, actions arising from the minutes? No? Okay, then we'll move on to the report of the internal auditor. Karen, will you introduce this, please?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, just a routine report from me. Again, nothing too much to say, really. Plans progressing well. Everything's in place to complete by the end of the year. I think in terms of the high level actions, it's showing that a number of overdue and outstanding actions continues to be a fairly low level. There's been a couple of variations to the plan since we last spoke to you. So they both relate to PCC reviews, one around the consultation and one around the changes that were possibly going to go ahead, and there's no need for that at the moment. What that has done is brought the audit days back down to more the level that we would expect them to be. So you may recall that the plan was quite high this year compared to our sort of contracted days. So we're still slightly over, but it's sort of a more reasonable level to adjust for over the 3-year average. So that was really all I wanted to say, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Karen. Gordon, I believe you have a question.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Karen, you say you're on target to finish a programme.
Yeah.
But before I start on that, let me congratulate you on getting the quality assurance on your audit team and getting that done. And also, it's good to see that you got a sort of a 98% customer satisfaction. Unfortunately, the problem with this is that the only way is down after this.
You're right there. Hard to maintain.
My only question is, with 29% of the audit program still remaining, are you still confident that you'll get it completed with 38% in progress?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good question. Thank you. As you know, when we do the planning, we agree a quarter for each of the reviews to take place. So all of the reviews for quarter 1 to quarter to 3 are at various stages of completion. Obviously, we're about to allocate the work for quarter 4 and start the detailed scoping for that. I think it's fair to say that some of the reviews I would have liked to have had them completed by now. They haven't quite got there, but they're all progressing well now, and I'm confident that we will complete that work by the end of the year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Questions for Karen? No. The list of overdue recommendations, we have a paper in the confidential part covering these. Not a bad position, but we'll hone in on the high outstandings a bit later on in the meeting in the second session. Moving on, thank you, Karen, for that report. We move on to the Treasury Management report, and I believe Mike is going to talk about that. No, is Mike there?
Yes, hopefully, can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Mike. Welcome.
Okay, good. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you see me or not? Sorry.
Yeah, I can see you.
Yeah, sorry. So just introducing the standard mid-year update on Treasury management. So that's all the cash investments and borrowing. A few brief key points just to pull out from the report. Firstly, that there's been full compliance so far this year, so no breaches of the strategy, which is always good. There's been no new borrowing required. Indeed, small repayment has been made in line with loan terms. Generally, continue to internally borrow for any requirements. So that's just using the day-to-day cash balances to fund things. As I'm sure you're aware from outside of work, we're still in a very low interest rate environment. So the cash isn't earning a great deal, although the exception to that is the investments in pooled funds, which continue to give a good income return of over 4%. And the capital values of those pooled investments has also recovered as we've moved out of the pandemic. The final £1 million of investment into high yield investments was completed during the period. That's into the Fidelity Fund. Working with Arlene Close, our Treasury advisors, we will consider any potential further investments which would come back to you for approval. So that's really all there is to say on the report, but certainly happy to take any questions should you have any.
Thank you, Mike. I've got a couple of questions to kick the ball off.
Yeah.
I tuned into the recent Arlene Close briefing, as did my colleagues on the committee, and I was intrigued. There was a couple of diagrams which showed the relative investment performance of a number of bodies, and Hampshire Police was on the right hand side and not getting the same rate of return as notably Hampshire Fire, Winchester Council, or Hampshire Council. The reason put forward was, yeah, we're in different circumstances. We need the money, the cash, over the next 3 years, so we have to follow a different policy. Would you like to comment on that, Mike, and explain it a little bit more, please?
Yes, I mean, Andy may want to sort of help with this, but certainly I would say, so for the future, they have higher levels of cash that can be put out for much longer periods, and generally the longer you put out your investments, the more likely you are to get a higher rate of return on that. I don't know if Andy wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, can you hear me, Chair?
Yes, Andy, I can hear you.
Yeah, I mean, Mike's really sets out one of the main issues, certainly for the county, significant cash balances, so they're able to put more out, as Mike said. And from what it really means, they can put more into their pooled long-term funds, as we can't. Our cash is also a bit lumpy, so just recall that we get significant pensions grant during the year, but that has to be utilised and spent, so we can't tie that up long term because we need it, for cash flow purposes. So for those two reasons, really, overall cash balances are lower. We've got less than strategic long-term pool funds, so that is something that we are looking at in terms of can we tweak our strategy slightly, and just the availability of that in-year cash in terms of can't tie it up. So. Well, I guess the other point to add, I guess importantly, is that all the authorities you just mentioned are advised by Arlene Close, and we all follow the same investment strategy, investment advice. So it is just coming down to that availability of long-term cash and the timing of when we did those cash flows.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Andy. The other question that I had before handing on to others was, there's mention, Mike, of interest rates in the paper, and although they didn't go up the last time when the Bank of England committee met, there's an expectation that they are going to go up in the near future and maybe over next year. If I was to say, well, what's the impact analysis of this on the police investments and borrowing? What is it factored in, or would it have a significant impact?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I would say, although there is talk of interest rate rises, and I think the sort of likely scenario is that either sort of December or sometime up to March, we might go back up to 0.25% from the current 0.1%, and then possibly another small increase later on next year. If you sort of step back and put it in a historical context, it will still be left in a very low interest rate position. So I don't believe that there will be a significant change to the position in terms of relative interest being earned. I mean, it's certainly sort of factored in terms of that's where we see things going, and as things move and when the monetary policy decision does change, we'll obviously work closely with Arlene Close to see whether there's any movement we need to do going forward compared to where we are now.
Yeah, if I just add to that, Chair, I mean, one of the important factors to also bear in mind is we've got no new borrowing at all at the moment. So in that sense, and we've got no variable rate borrowing that's new, so our borrowing isn't impacted. Were we to take out newer long-term borrowing over the course of the next, 2 years, then potentially rates would be slightly higher than they are now. But as Mike, just set out, in historical context, they'll still be very, very low. So I think that they're the main impacts, and we may get a slight uptick in interest earned, but it's going to be very small.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Thanks, Mike. Liz, you have a question.
Thank you. Yes, I have a follow-up question on pensions and the fog that is the funding of public sector pensions, really. In 8.4, the OPCC made a prepayment on pension contributions for 1 year, and by so doing, made a saving, a not insignificant saving. I think Andy just now mentioned that there's a grant towards this. So my question is a process one. Are you robbing Peter to pay Paul here? Who was that prepayment made to, and how does the whole thing work to generate a saving in this way?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. So a couple of important distinctions first. The pensions grant I mentioned relates to police officer pensions, which is slightly different to 8.4, which relates to the LGPS pension contributions made on behalf of police staff. So 8.4 is specific to the local government pension scheme. You'll be aware, hopefully, that both the OPCC staff and Hampshire Constabulary staff are members of the Hampshire pension scheme. So every 3 years, there's an actuarial evaluation of the scheme. And part of the assumptions that the actuary will make is the level of overall investment return that we'll make over that 3-year period. And that's based on the standard cash flows as well that the scheme actuary would expect to receive over that 3-year period. So what we did for the first time as part of the last valuation, which was 2019, I think, was in discussion with the actuary, and other pension funds do this. We made available for the first time the option for all LGPS, or certainly the key employers within the LGPS scheme locally, to be able to make a prepayment. The effect of the prepayment means that, in effect, we're putting the, in this case, for the OPCC, rather than drip feeding that 11.98 million in over 12 months, that went in on day one on the 1st of April. So clearly the pension fund is able to invest that sum of money much earlier. In terms of the benefit, the pension fund gets to invest it much earlier. It's made an assumption about the investment growth it will get or required over that 3-year period. So in return for us making that 1-year prepayment, the pension fund is paying us an interest rate reflective of them getting the cash early. So we don't get the full, you're not going to get the full benefit, and we're going to get far more than what we've received and put it out to the market. And clearly the pension fund will make far more by getting it up front than we'll receive through the kind of extra interest. But in effect, that's what it is. We're getting an interest rate, and I can't recall off the top of my head what the rate was, to compensate us for paying it early, because that gives the pension fund the ability to invest it much sooner up front. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of how that works. And there's an option to make either a 1-year payment or a 3-year prepayment. We looked at our cash balance, and probably actually this links quite nicely back to the Chair's question. So we looked at our long-term cash balances going forward, and we took the decision that we could only afford to make that prepayment on an annual basis, and we'd review it each year to see where the cash position was. We couldn't see that we could tie it up for that 3-year period, whereas other authorities, where to look at their long-term cash balances, determined they could make that payment up front for 3 years. So we did a 1-year prepayment and got the benefit of that. Some authorities did a 3-year prepayment and got a better, better return. So it kind of links back to the Chair's question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gordon.
Thank you. Andrew, my thanks to you for arranging the Arling Close seminar. I always look forward to it, and it's always an excellent seminar. So my thanks to them and the team. Going back to interest rates, if I'd asked if this meeting was about 2-3 weeks before, my question would have been different, because at first they were talking about interest rates being going up to, inflation going up to about 4.5%, and that it was going to be a temporary blip. It's a fact. It is inevitable that the Bank of England will raise interest rate, but they won't raise it more than a very small percentage. I recognise that, because the economy is not in a good state to take higher interest rate rises. But the fact is that irrespective of whatever interest rate that the Bank of England decides to settle on, inflation rate for the forthcoming year is going to be between 4 and 4.5%, or that's the forecast. So in fact, it's already come to that now. Does this mean that you will, with the way you're managing your funds, does this mean that expenditure in the police force will now rise, and you may need to borrow to do that, and then there'll be a cost to that, and therefore your treasury management forecast will have to be adjusted?
No, I don't think so. There's a couple of points really. So we've probably touched on this point previously. We're unable to borrow for revenue purposes in any event. So we can only borrow for capital purposes. So we're unable to support the revenue budget through borrowing, which that means the budget must be self-sustainable. So as we approach next year's precept and budget, we've already embarked on detailed discussions with the PCC and the Chief Constable. And as part of those discussions, we're trying to make an assessment, an educated assessment, which we've not got the detail, in terms of what our overall grant settlement will look like and what the potential is on raising the precept. You may have picked up from the spending review that the precept increase can be £10, up to £10 per annum for each of the next 3 years. In terms of that medium-term forecast, what we will do is we'll dial in those best guesses around inflation. And that's a mixed bag really. So we'll put in a best guess around pay going forward. Then we'll put in a general inflation rate linked probably to the October/November CPI measure, which I think, as you say, was just ticked over 4%. But we'll also put in specific baskets of inflation costs. So for example, utilities or construction inflation, because they are running at a much higher rate than the general rate of inflation. So we just plug all that into the budget, and it becomes an affordability equation in terms of what do we think total spend will be versus what do we think total grant and precept income will be, and then we look to balance the budget accordingly, either through not funding as much growth as you'd like, or indeed, if the settlement's really, really tight, having to make some savings, and that's how we balance it off.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Are there any other questions on the Treasury management paper? No? Well, thank you very much for that, Mike. Thank you. We'll move on then.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
We'll come on now to the procurement of external auditor paper. Can I just ask before we start, are there any external auditors present at this meeting? Don't think there are.
Melanie, yeah, you've got Sarah Crofty.
I have. Sorry, I
You
missed
do.
that.
Sorry,
Sarah.
yeah, you've got Sarah here from EY.
From EY. Yeah, I think the paper is on principle who we're going to what we're all going to adapt. So I don't think you're conflicted. But I just thought I'd check that. Andy, are you going to present the paper?
I'll give a very brief intro, but Rob, who you'll have met before, Rob Sarfas, is going to bring the paper to you. So it just links to the decision timeline. You'll be aware that we procured last time through PSAA. We're looking forward now to the next procurement. We have to make our opt-in decision if that's the route we go down by February next year. But I'll stop there because Rob can talk you through the paper.
Thank you. Hi, Rob.
Hi, hello, good afternoon, everyone. So, as Andy says, this report is about the annual audit of the accounts for the PCC and the Chief Constable. You'll be aware we've just been through the audit for the previous year's accounts, which was the third year of 5 under the current arrangements. So EY are the current auditors, so they were appointed through the public sector audit appointments process. And as part of that, police made the same decision as 98% of eligible bodies to join that national scheme last time around. So that was after the abolition of the audit commission, and the introduction of the Local Audit and Accountability Act. So PSAA are now beginning the procurement process for appointing auditors for the next 5-year period, which is from April 2023. Which seems quite a long way off at the moment, but PSAA need to know by March of 2022 which authorities want to opt into that scheme, and that's because they then need to run a large procurement exercise and arrange the appointment of individual auditors. So, and I know Andy's spoken to the PCC about this, and she's anticipating opting into the arrangement again. There are 2 other options available, both of which involve running a more local procurement process. So that's either individually or working with other authorities as well. Under both of those options, obviously there's the need to resource a compliant procurement process and then manage the contract, but it also requires the establishment of an independent auditor panel to advise on the appointment as well. So you'll have heard at previous meetings of the Joint Audit Committee and from our current auditors EY about some of the challenges within the audit market at the moment. So there's a relatively small pool of audit firms to select from, as local authority bodies can only appoint registered auditors. And so across all 3 of the options, you'd be looking at the same audit firms being available within the market. So the PSAA scheme does come with the disadvantage, of course, that you won't know the price of the audit fees prior to opting in, but it's a large national scheme and it's therefore likely to offer more economies of scale to the audit firms, and therefore should come with a better chance of securing a more favourable price than procuring locally. And then as a result, also the procurement and contract management costs are shared across all of the bodies that opt in, rather than falling solely on an individual body. Another thing that it's worth just being aware of is that, of course, for the PCC and the Chief Constable, the same finance team produced the accounts as for the County Council and the Fire and Rescue Authority, use the same financial systems and use the same auditor. And there are economies of scale again that come with that, and the PSAA will be able to ensure that the same audit firm is appointed to all partners. And I think that's pretty much all I need to say, other than just to highlight that it's the PCC that makes the appointment. The Chief Constable isn't able to make a separate auditor appointment and has to use the same auditor as the PCC. So I'm happy to take any questions. Or
Thank you,
Yeah,
Rob.
I just had a few bits, Chair, is that okay?
Yeah.
I mean, Rob mentioned the other partners locally, and it is set out in the report, but just to put it up front, really, that we did talk to all the CFOs across the partnership. So we talked to Hampshire County Council CFO, Fire CFO, and of course Richard sat alongside me as a constabulary CFO in those discussions. And we did, talk through the various routes, but collectively we landed on option 3 as being the most appropriate. And therefore, both Hampshire County Council will be making a recommendation to their audit committee to full council to go with option 3. And Hampshire Fire and Rescue Authority, Hampshire and the Isle of Wight Fire and Rescue Authority will be making the same recommendation to their audit committee as well, to full Fire Authority to go with option 3. So in that sense, all the partners locally are aligning to the same recommendation to opt in versus option 3.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Before I ask Peter, can I just make one point, Rob? You touched on it. I'm happy with what's going on in the recommendation to opt in, but the point you made about you need to opt in pretty soon before you know the contract prices. So we're relying on someone else, PSA, I presume, to manage the budget. Can I just put a question to you? I understand the difficulties of this, but thinking of signing a blank check sort of scenario, just supposing we opt in and the fees come out to be exorbitant or much higher than we thought, is there a get-out clause on the grounds of price?
I don't think there is, Rob, is there? Once you're opted in, I think.
I think so, yeah.
I think
so once you've opted in, you pay the price, whatever it is.
Yeah, but I think it's taking that in the round, Chair. So if we were procuring locally, we still wouldn't know the price before we procured in the marketplace. In theory, we'd be doing it as a single or very small procurement. So going back to Rob's kind of key point, this is a national procurement that will be hundreds of bodies for which PSAA are appointing and through which auditors are seeking to gain, a sizable market share. So I guess the economics would suggest that bulk purchasing power should deliver a better overall price than just going it alone as a very small cohort locally. So we'd have the same issue locally, but I think just the general economics around it would suggest that we will be better in the pack. I think just picking up on price, it is worth saying up front, there has been significant pressure in the external audit market. What some might describe as a race to the bottom in terms of pricing. That's not served the audit firms well, it's not served any of the public sector well. So I guess, even though you are on the call, I wouldn't be surprised if we see an upward pressure in overall price terms, because probably the last procurement delivered market rates that were too low. So I think there will inevitably be some price increase. And where EY and other audit firms across the country have put in fee rise permissions to PSAA, some of those have been accepted due to the market pressure, and some have been batted back in terms of not applicable. So PSAA are able to hear requests for increased fees at the moment. Some of those have been accepted, which I think goes back to my point about audit fees probably too low to start with, but some will reject on the basis they actually weren't that fair. So there is some kind of check and balance in the overall position once you go forward. But ultimately, I suspect there may be some price increase nationally to take account of all the factors that we brought to you previously around pressure in the audit market.
Okay, thank you. Peter. Peter? We lost you, Peter.
Unless you're just on mute, Peter.
You're on mute, Peter.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Much better.
I'm terribly sorry.
That's
I'm
okay.
terribly sorry. I'm sure you prefer me muted. Anyway, my comment was that one of the things that sold generally the PSAA arrangement originally 5 years ago was the prospect that new players were likely to get into the major public sector audit market more easily by being selected for appropriate sized audits through the PSAA than they were likely to competing with the big four, as it were, individually on appointments. So I don't know whether that's been successful or not, but it does seem to me that if that's still likely and is still happening, that generally will bring more players into the market and therefore will have potentially a beneficial impact on fee levels generally. My question, however, was, I appreciate this has come up because we've come to the end of a 5-year cycle, so we have the option. But is there in fact any change of any substance over the issues that we looked at 5 years ago? I think Melvin pointed out in the members' meeting that there's some slightly different supervision of the PSAA now at a higher level. There's a different oversight. But from our point of view, are we actually looking at any different considerations or any different changes than we looked at when we made the decision 5 years ago?
I don't think so, but there's been a lot of activity.
Now you're muted.
You're muted, Andy.
Shouldn't be.
We can hear you now.
You're not now.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of activity in the external audit world through government reviews, the Redmond Review, and various other things that you'll have picked up. And some of that links to the concerns around oversight, the concerns around the pressures in the market. But fundamentally, from us as an authority point of view, not a lot of change. We'll still require an external auditor to, review the final accounts and to do that whole final account sign-off process. So, kind of, our outward-looking gaze hasn't really changed, albeit the environment in which the audit world operates is much different. The government oversight has changed, the government concern has changed, and there's been a number of big reviews. So we're in a different world in that sense. And I think the other thing that perhaps is different as we approach this next procurement is just the recognition that the availability of public sector auditors, even across the large firms, has proved problematic. So recruitment remains an issue, and retaining suitably qualified and experienced staff has been a challenge even for the biggest of the audit firms. And going back to Peter's point, I don't think there was much penetration from mainly the smaller firms at all, to the best of my knowledge, but that probably comes down to that issue around availability of resource, availability of knowledge, and the ability to just tap into the public sector, at short notice, whereas the large firms, that significant history. And most of the large firms took TUPE staff across from the Audit Commission, so had a ready pool of staff, ready to go, who could just step into the audit world straight away of local government, police, fire, etc. So I think that's just a bit of contextual issues around it. A lot going on in the audit world, but in terms of our outward-facing position, much the same in terms of our needs and requirements.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, Catherine.
Hello there. Within the PSA papers somewhere, there was a slightly pessimistic phrase around having to extend current contracts if they're not able to secure, sufficient bidders, new entrants, whatever it may be. I mean, is that a realistic scenario, or are they just sort of covering themselves on a hypothetical, do you think?
I'll pick it up, Rob.
It's hard to say, really. I
think
it
all comes down to price, maybe.
Yeah,
it's price.
Yeah, and the interest from the existing audit firms. It's a benefit, I suppose, of the current arrangements that there is that scope within there to extend the existing contract should there be any issues that arise. I would imagine it's much more likely that there wouldn't be issues going through a national scheme for PSAA, because the audit firms have only got to bid once effectively to join that scheme, whereas to go through lots of individual procurement processes with individual authorities is a much bigger burden for the audit firm. So I suppose there's less risk of it happening through that route than if you went individually, that you
Sure.
wouldn't get an auditor.
So the contingency's there, but it's unlikely to come into play. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions on this paper? No, I mean, we've considered it, we've made some comments, and I think we're all agreeing it's a sensible way to go, as the paper outlines. So thank you for that, Rob.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.
Okay. That, I think, completes the public session. Is there any other business on the public session? Peter? You have your hand up? You have your hand up, Peter, and you're muted. Ah, okay.
Sorry, I had muted myself, but I had not taken my hand down. I've now done both.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, so that completes the public session.